Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Korea Economic Institute of America. My name is Kyle Ferrier. I'm the Director of Academic Affairs and Research here at KEI. Today's program is part of our academic paper series, through which KEI commissions up to 10 papers each year. And we invite our authors to come in and present their research in events such as these. And at the end of the year, compile the papers into our On Korea Journal, which you can find outside on the tables, as well as the paper for today's program. In giving today's discussion a title, you may have noticed we borrowed the U.S. Forces Korea motto, "We Go Together." As recent developments have shown, ranging from the threat of global pandemics to massive cyber attacks, upholding our shared security interests in the 21st century requires more than traditional military cooperation. Working closely with Korea on critical science and technology issues, many of which Korea is a global leader in, not only helps to prepare the alliance to face new challenges, but also deepens people-to-people ties and creates opportunities for innovative business development. Our speaker today, Mr. Sean Connell, is quite well placed to discuss the importance of this cooperation for new administrations in both Seoul and Washington. And specifically, he will look at areas that have been termed as the new frontiers of cooperation, which I will let Sean talk a little bit more about. Sean is also currently the Director of Business Recruitment for the Economic Development Alliance of Skagit County, Washington. He's the former Executive Director of U.S. Korea Business Council at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce here in D.C. So he's both well-versed on issues at the national level and the subnational level. So we'll have some really great dynamic and new perspectives to discuss today. Sean's bio can be found on the back of your flyer for today's program. So I'll let Sean start us off. You can do the PowerPoint from here, and afterwards we'll have some time for Q&A. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Kyle, for the introduction, and it's good to be back here at the Korea Economic Institute. I've had the pleasure of working very closely with KEI for all the years I've been involved with the U.S.-Korea relationship, and really appreciate the work this organization does to build and enhance the bilateral relationship in both countries. It's also great to see many old friends here today, too, and to be back in this Washington. My remarks today will focus on the interface between science, technology, innovation, and within the bilateral economic relationship, particularly as it relates to what have been called the new frontiers of cooperation areas. And I'll be referring to these as new frontiers for short. These are a set of issues, as many of you may know, that were advanced on the bilateral agenda at the October 2015 summit between then Presidents Obama and Park Geun-hye. And they include science and technology at a very broad level, but also security, space, climate change and sustainability. This is inclusive of energy, and global health and combating biological threats. The position of these issues at the nexus of economic opportunity and national security make them ideal areas for cooperation between the United States and Korea, and offer a new framework to focus on issues that are increasingly at the fore of both national, bilateral, and then the international agenda as well, and importantly are non-controversial issues in the relationship, so they're a good story. At a time of transition politically in both countries, there are opportunities for continuity in certainly the security relationship, but also the economic relationship, and some forward-looking areas for economic engagement moving forward. And amidst concerns have been raised here, the domestic context around trade represent sectors in which U.S. businesses are quite competitively placed to do good in the Korean market, both introducing products and through partnerships, due to the innovation nature of these. Importantly, there are also areas where Korea is increasingly a technology leader as well, and over the course of the presentation, I'll be sharing some that just show really how far Korea has come and how high Korea is in the global spectrum of technology capabilities, particularly in these areas. Realizing the full bilateral potential, including on the economic side of these new frontiers areas, requires long-term continuity in engagement, dialogue, and activity at multiple levels of government, not just national, but also at the state and regional levels. And so in short, and the overarching point I'll be making today is that these new frontier areas should continue to be a priority for the leadership in both countries. I'll start with some background on the new frontiers areas, then explore where these reflect national policies and capabilities, along with some examples of bilateral activity in these areas where their economic aspects are implicated. Very wide swath of issues, and so I'm just going to pick out a couple of areas where there have been a bit more activity. I'm sure there are great examples that And if you're familiar with some of those, I'll love to hear about those during the discussion around. I'll conclude with some thoughts on potential approaches that could encourage economic engagement in the I'm very much looking forward to our discussion. Thoughts and questions. Let's okay. As mentioned earlier, the new frontier areas were announced of issues during the 15 President Summit. And Korea described the issue category as, quote, increasingly safe in the 21st century, and on which the two countries will expertise and contributions. First glance, this may all of various issues, but they have several common elements, most fundamental and bases within psychology. But some of the additional linkages and commonalities that make them very interesting areas include a focus on research and development, including through training and education exchanges and accelerating new technologies, reducing threats to both national and economic security, initiatives at both national and global levels, and sectors in which there's significant convergence of technologies from different fields taking place, which is creating new capabilities, new industries that are driving new growth in both countries. Additionally, each reflect ongoing bilateral initiatives rather than new projects. And in fact, if you look back through previous joint statements by the two administrations, several of these issues featured very prominently in the joint statement issued from the May 2013 Senate, the first between Presidents Park and Obama. And going back further, particularly in some areas like energy, there's been quite a lot of activity in the past. So these are not new areas, and in fact, as I go through some of the specific activities that were highlighted in the joint fact sheet where these were articulated, there's been quite a lot going on. Taken collectively, I think there's a good case to be made that these areas and the fact that they would be brought up and elevated in the agenda reflects the overall evolution of the U.S.-Korea relationship, especially over the last couple of decades, where we're having converging priorities, but also capabilities in the United States and Korea on science, technology, innovation, and economic development. And importantly, they build on a long and robust partnership between the two countries. There's been a fair amount of coevolution as Korea has very rapidly emerged as an advanced economy with the United States. This has come together. So again, just these are very natural areas, looking back over the broader scope of the bilateral relationship for continued and future engagement. So within the joint fact sheet, and some of you may have seen this, there's quite a bit of detail, and so I'll just very quickly summarize in my remarks on these slides some of the activities related to these 6 areas that were highlighted. First was the topic of countering biological threats and advancing the global health agenda. And these were both within the national and at a global context. It includes collaboration between government agencies, particularly the National Institutes of Health, on advancing biomedical research, training personnel exchanges, and also activities to address threats. Just months before the summit meeting took place, of course, Korea encountered a MERS outbreak, which rattled the economy, amongst other things. And so the importance of dealing with these and also thinking back over the last decade of the very significant impacts that avian flu and other such pandemics have had, certainly within the Asia-Pacific and elsewhere. Second, combating climate change. And this category focused quite extensively on new energy technologies, including smart grid, hydrogen and fuel cells, and also in implementing projects for microgrid analysis, design, and energy storage systems. And also cooperation on global initiatives, including achieving an ambitious outcome of the Paris COP21 meeting, mobilizing climate finance, including through the green, and other such initiatives. Third and closely related is investing in a sustainable environment, and this is beyond the topic of climate change, but underscores areas where there is quite a bit of activity that's been taking place. This includes under the environmental frameworks that were set up in the Chorus FDA. Collaboration on Arctic issues. Korea is a permanent observer to the Arctic Council, and this is an increasingly important area as the ice continues to thin out, and opportunities for economic activity, but also security considerations come to the fore there. And then collaboration on sustainable fisheries initiatives, amongst others. One that's been highlighted is some work that's been done between NO and its Korea counterpart, looking at ocean acidification and other issues that are very important for the broader marine fisheries sector. Fourth, increasing cyber collaboration. Oops. So. Okay. Sorry about that. And cyber in some ways goes without saying, and just how important this is becoming, not just for Korea, not just for the United States, but for the global economy and security as a whole. This has also been an area where there's been quite a bit of activity bilaterally, both on the security front, as well as in the civilian spheres, such as through the U.S.-Korea Information and Communication Technology Policy Forum. But in the Frontiers discussion, there's also emphasis placed on further building on these, sharing best practices for cyber defense, how to address threats to critical infrastructure, investigating cyber incidents, and then also joint research and development and workforce training in cybersecurity fields. Fifth, exploring space collaboration. And this is an interesting area, which, as I'll mention later, is relatively recent within the bilateral relationships. But one of the goals that's actually been accomplished in the time since the October 2015 summit has been concluding a framework agreement in aeronautics and the exploration and use of aerospace and outer space for civil and peaceful purposes. Very long name, but basically a framework bilaterally that will articulate how the two countries work together on a number of particularly civil space issues, observational and meteorological research, manned space down the road, and things of that nature. There are also many other activities that have been taking place. Chorus AQ is a project that has also started to move forward, and then other initiatives that relate to meteorological satellites to utilize data to improve weather forecasts and warnings. And then sixth, expanding science and technology cooperation. And one thing that stood out to me in looking through the statements that were made by the governments when these were announced is a reaffirmation of, quote, the deep and enduring bilateral relationship in science and technology cooperation. This is not something you tended to hear in a lot of statements, at least in the time that I've been working looking at U.S.-Korea economic relations, and that they call out the importance of science, technology, and innovation to shared economic prosperity and to achieving mutual goals, including each of these sector areas. The statement also highlights several other areas where there are interests and activity as relates to the science and technology fields, and the sampling of these would include nanotechnology, advanced manufacturing, information and communications technology research, other things that are the foundation for Internet of Things, and probably if there's something science-related, even if not captain in the statement, it's probably implied. As I mentioned, there are several common elements to each of these. And this linkage between science, technology, and innovation, economic development is an important one. From experience working in regional economic development initiatives over the last few years, one of the most important goals that we work with is to foster the most conducive environment, both that will ensure that new businesses and existing businesses can grow, expand, and prosper, the right conditions in place for investment to enter into the area, both domestic and foreign, and then to facilitate capacity building that helps support communities and regions capture the benefits of this growth on a sustained basis. Similarly, many innovation policies conducted at the national level with a base on science and technology are really aiming to advance economic development, economic growth. And a parallel here is in fostering the right conditions that will encourage innovation-driven growth, having the right infrastructure in place, both in terms of physical, regulatory, legal, educational, and all that. So there's some very interesting parallels looking at economic development more broadly, and then specifically innovation and the science and technology aspect of these. And these have been increasing areas of focus in both U.S. and Korean domestic policy measures, and in which the new frontier sectors have emerged quite prominently, including as target sectors for new industry growth. Both countries. I have a short summary up here. Within the United States, to give a few examples, global health initiatives, new space, clean technologies are very rapidly reshaping their sectors. About 10 years ago, the Obama administration had released its strategy for American innovation, which had updated a couple of times over the course of its 2 terms. And if you read through that document, there are many ways in which the new frontier sectors identified bilaterally emerge in that strategy as strategic initiatives for R&D investments, for catalyzing breakthrough technologies to help spur new growth. Also significant is that it called out cybersecurity as fundamental to the framework, fundamental to the infrastructure required to facilitate future growth for the U.S. as an innovation economy. And particularly given the news of the last week in particular, something that's certainly been on my mind thinking about, what are the implications of this for the new ways of doing business, new business models, and what can be done when there are these sorts of risks out there as our economy becomes more digital. In Korea, likewise, biotechnology, nanotech, new energy technology, space, and Internet of Things are just a sampling of some of these areas that have been very prominently focused in new target growth industries, and have had a very prominent role also within broader Korea science and tech policy initiatives, again aimed at promoting the growth of these industries and the economy more broadly. And these activities go back to the Kim Dae-jung administration, which had actively worked to boost Korea's research and development investments, and also investments in basic research. Most recently, President Park's creative economy agenda includes significant focus not just on promoting convergence technologies, but also in really trying to reshape and address some of the structural framework challenges perceived as holding Korea back for gaining in some of these areas. So it's important to recognize that Korea is increasingly at the technology frontier and a global leader in many technologies, including related to the new frontiers areas. And I'll go through fairly quickly here a set of slides, and these are all indicators available through the OECD's Science, Technology, and Industry scorecard. They should be out with a new one at some point this year. They do these every. But it offers an interesting of where in the OECD advanced, where Korea sits in terms of investments, patents, and other capabilities. Technology, leading actor in at least 11 of these, including related to human interface for digital data transfer, which is a set of technologies under the Internet of Things. Also, some other things that you'll see in here where Korea scores quite well on include battery manufacturing, sensitive semiconductor devices, and multiplex communication systems and mobile apps, amongst others. Korea is also a leader in patent family share of disruptive technologies. Oh, actually, before I get to this is another thing that shows just where Korea stands within ICT-related technologies, in which it's a very strong global leader. As relates to selected disruptive technologies, again, Korea is doing quite well in patent family share there. These are the kinds of established technology and new generation and these are very important. Korea is also increasingly as a patent leader and a leader in R&D in several specific new frontier sectors. This slide shows some climate change mitigation technologies, and these 5 countries, the top 5 of the set that was looked at, which is why 5 countries here. But again, the yellow dots there point to where that level was in terms of patents in the 2003 timeframe category. It's a good visual of some of the advances that Korea has been making. And that, particularly in nanotech, that narrow green bars. And I can speak a bit more about this later on, but in tandem with its rise into the ranks of the advanced economies, Korea has also increasingly taken on many global leadership roles economically, and this includes in relation to some of the new frontiers areas. One of the best examples I can point to goes back to the Lee Myung-bak administration and its low-carbon green growth initiative, which had both domestic and global aspects, including at the time, very ambitious climate change commitment to reduce carbon emissions, but also to really accelerate new technologies, both for renewable energies and then energy efficiencies, both to reduce carbon, but also to advance new economic growth sectors. All that said, Korea continues to have some room for improvement in tackling structural constraints that have held it back from its full potential for science, technology, and innovation-driven economic growth. I'll step back one slide. And this set of issues, I'm sure, will be familiar to many of you in this room who have been following these issues and have been following the Korean economy. They are not new. They're well understood, and successive Korean governments have taken very active initiatives to try to address these. And one thing that came up quite a bit and was a major focus of the creative economy policies over the last 5 years was to enhance the environment for new high-tech startups and entrepreneurship. Korea is, as can be seen, it's probably hard to see from there, but Korea's somewhat in the higher end of the spectrum in terms of where there are administrative, regulatory, and other barriers. It will be interesting to see over the coming years as we see more output from some of the new access to finance and other things that the Park administration did. What are the longer-term impacts? Have these policies met their goal? And are they having their intended effect? Korea also has comparatively lower levels of international scientific collaboration on research and development. And that's important because it really builds linkages with ideas taking place outside the country, also opportunities to get information on the good research that you're doing out to broader audiences. And I'll flag this because this is one area in which, as others have noted, that engagement with the U.S. in some of these activities, be it on a research and development basis, be it economically and other things, may have beneficial effects for what Korea is trying to do at many levels as relates to these new frontiers areas. As mentioned earlier, there have been a lot of activities that the two countries have done, certainly on science and technology. In many cases, as was the case with the Creative Economy Agenda and earlier activities that the Kim Dae-jung administration had tried to do. There's an awful lot of policy modeling. Folks in Korea have taken a look at what has been successful models in various cases in the United States. For the creative economy, some of the activities in Silicon Valley were certainly a model, and tried to apply it there. And so there's a good interplay of ideas and exchange that these fall into and build upon. To share a few examples of where we have seen some activity specific to these areas, where we could see some more activity, I'll highlight examples in two specific sectors. One falls into the category of climate change and energy, particularly new and renewable energy technologies. And nuclear energy, which is somewhat outside the scope of what I'm talking about today, has of course been an area of collaboration for decades between the two countries. There's an immense amount of activity, and it's important to note that within the low carbon green growth policy initiative of the Lee administration, nuclear was a major component for how Korea was going to meet that ambitious target. And it's very interesting seeing the initial energy positions of the Moon Jae-in administration. There's a goal of significantly reducing, if not eliminating, that nuclear energy quotient. So it'll be interesting to see, as I'll talk about a little bit later, what the strategy is for making this shift in having a very ambitious carbon reduction percentage, but one that doesn't incorporate the existing nuclear and tries to build up renewable energy from what's currently an extremely low baseline. But there's been a lot going on bilaterally in these areas beyond nuclear as well. In 2011, the U.S. Department of Energy and its counterpart in Korea established the U.S.-Korea Clean Energy Technology Partnership. And this area focused on strengthening cooperation and R&D related to clean energy, including through information exchange and some joint projects on efficiency, particularly smart grid and microgrid was a major area of focus, but even areas including fuel cell, carbon capture, and energy storage. Some examples that were directly tied in with this or happened at the time, and if they weren't direct, there have been projects between the national labs. There's one that's highlighted in the paper that took place between Sandia National Laboratories and the Korea Energy Research Institute on advanced smart grid systems with the goal of developing some international standards as a result of this. Around the same time, independent of this, but was a really interesting example that was frequently highlighted was when LG Chemical's battery was selected for use in the Chevy Volt. And I recall that being actively here working in support of the Korea Free Trade Agreement, there's a lot of attention pointing out this is a good example of where the U.S. and Korea are working together to advance critical technologies and get them out to the public. Looking ahead, energy is going to be interesting, as I mentioned, because of the positions that President Moon has put forward with his ambitions to reduce Korea's dependence on nuclear, on coal, and to expand renewable energy. And while here in the United States, the Trump administration has put much more emphasis than in recent years on domestic oil, coal, gas, and presumably nuclear. So that said, just looking at the basis and the background of what has taken place bilaterally in some of these areas, there's still quite a lot of work to be done, even if these positions do create a slight amount of divergence. For example, Korea, as I mentioned, is starting from a very low baseline for renewable energy as part of its energy portfolio. This is an area where, of course, there's a lot of capabilities here in the United States and lots of opportunities for expanded joint activity between the two countries. Additionally, looking at the priorities of the Trump administration on coal, there is some background between the two countries working on coal, clean coal, and then carbon capture and storage. Korea was part of the FutureGen project during the Bush administration. It now has a commercial gasification plant that just went online last year, and joining a few that are in the United States. And so maybe there's some opportunities for engagement around some of those. And of course, nuclear is going to continue to remain a very important aspect, particularly as Korea either expands or if it does pull back its nuclear footprints over the coming years. This is also an area that I'll speak to in a moment at the state and local level, where there have been some interesting things starting up and where there could be some interesting opportunities moving forward. Space, as I mentioned, is a comparatively new area within the relationship, due in part to longstanding U.S. concerns about proliferation of dual-use technologies. And I remember during the years that I was actively involved with the U.S. Korea Business Council, space is a topic that very rarely, if ever, came up. But it's been interesting to see that there's a bit more activity there. And one thing that I think makes this really intriguing at this time has been the increase of commercial space, especially around the so-called new space industries, where there's a convergence of the use of information technology and big data, coupled with, as technology has advanced, the entry barrier for the market's becoming extremely low. And in cities across the country, Seattle has gotten a lot of attention. Boulder, Colorado, there's a few others. I'm assuming Southern Cal is in the mix too. There's some really interesting companies doing very exciting things that weren't going to be possible 10, if not even 5 years ago. And while I'm not sure specifically what level of engagement there already may be with Korean partners there, given some of the strong capabilities of Korean companies and research universities in this sector, this could seem to be a very natural area for engagement. And some of the key goals and aspirations of these two sectors are also coming up quite a bit. The Park government, for example, had expressed interest in fostering competitiveness amongst Korean firms in satellite energy and communications, and also being able to contribute to, for example, using space-based data for humanitarian assistance and environmental management. And these are some of the goals and aspirations of some of the new space companies that have been starting up, that are developing new satellites that they're going to be launching for small sats for constellations. And as the cost to access this data and imagery goes way down, it becomes available to way more people. Let's get back here. And in speaking about cities, this gets into the really interesting area that I don't think gets a lot of discussion here in Washington, D.C. as much, and that is what can be done at the subnational level, particularly state, regional, and local. It's often the case in the United States that a lot of really interesting things, new technologies, new ways of doing things emerge at a state and local level, and those that are successful can often be picked up for broader regional or national models. Korea tends to be a bit more top-down, though certainly boosting and spreading economic development across all regions of Korea has been extremely important. And in many ways, these new frontiers are already emerging as areas for bilateral cooperation at a local level. They've been pursued very ad hoc, but do share some common elements, including a focus on, similar to the new frontiers topics as a whole, emphasis on R&D and technology solutions, interest certainly on the part of U.S. communities in drawing inbound investment from Korea, particularly around new technology, high-growth sectors, and also by interest in Korean stakeholders in obtaining access to really good research and other capabilities here in the United States. To share a few examples of this, energy has been an active field in tandem with what's been going on at the national level, particularly in smart grid, where there's also been a concerted effort by Korean companies to deploy their technologies internationally. And some smart grid projects have been pursued in Illinois, Hawaii, and then just last fall, an agreement was signed with the state of Maryland to have, I think KEPCO is going to have some demonstration devices on the campus of Montgomery College in Maryland. Health technology is another, and there have been activities here for years. I remember being really surprised going to an event several years ago where I met people who were officials from the Chungcheongnam-do provincial government who were hanging out in some biotech incubators in Montgomery County, and were looking to get some companies from Korea over there as well, particularly to have access to the kinds of research and capabilities going on at the National Institute for Health. And so Maryland has been a focal area for this. And then in recent years, looking at broader science and technology areas, and while this may not strictly fall within any of the more industry-specific new frontiers areas, one thing that I've been involved with over the last couple of years has been activities by the Korean Consul General in Seattle to build connections relating to composites and carbon fiber. This relates in great part to the activity in the broader aerospace industry within Western Washington. We now have two major international carbon fiber manufacturers there, in addition to a lot of very innovative companies in the composites and carbon fiber space. And there's quite a bit of interest in building more interconnections at the supply chain level between Korea's aerospace industry, which is small but growing, and then certainly the Boeing supply chain in the greater Seattle area. And composites are an interesting area for this, including because Washington's sister province in Korea, Jeollabuk-do, is home to Korea's KC Tech, which is the Korean government-funded carbon fiber research institution. And so over the last couple of years, the State Department of Commerce, together with the Consulate General, have organized some conferences that have brought together some key stakeholders and manufacturers from both countries in these areas. It's a very early conversation, but will be interesting to see, is this sustained, particularly in line with as new programs move forward and as more funding becomes available. Some considerations for economic engagement around the new frontiers areas. As I mentioned, U.S. firms are particularly strong in new frontiers technologies and services. These position them very well in Korea's market, which is increasingly mature, very competitive. You have to have something new to really do well there. And the U.S. Foreign Commercial Service and its country commercial guide for Korea has highlighted several of these new frontier areas as these are particularly good prospects for U.S. firms that have very good technology, very good products in these areas. Cybersecurity, to share one example, is called out, particularly for U.S. firms that may have good critical infrastructure and encryption protections, end-to-end point detection, firewalls, and smart device information. So that's a good story. If for businesses of all sizes from all parts of the country, they may have a really compelling product or service that may not exist in Korea yet, that could be a really good market to look in. At the same time, it's also important to consider factors within both countries that will not just facilitate, but that might also constrain engagement opportunities to grow and to do market entry. These are regulatory, these are business, and even political. This is a good point to speak about the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement, or the Course FTA, because it does include several provisions that are very important for the longer-term growth and expansion of new frontiers industries. Very specifically, intellectual property protections, provisions on regulatory transparency and leveling the playing field, standards and testing procedures, and other similar provisions. And ensuring that these provisions are fully implemented and continue to move forward is going to be really valuable, I think, for facilitating more activity between the two countries, not just trade one way or the other way, but also for the propensity for joint projects down the road. Related to technology demonstration projects, and I shared a few examples of that. Some key considerations, and these aren't unique to Korea or the U.S., but really many of these projects as a whole, is considering what the pathways are for these projects. Is it just a showcase of technology ultimately, or are there some things that are being developed through these that will really help with its commercialization and deployment? In regional areas, are there opportunities for local businesses, local partners that are being found, or is it just something that kind of stands alone and doesn't phase in? Again, this is not unique to Korea. This is really a case for any projects, but these are some of the things that I think, and those have pointed out, will need to be considered looking at these sorts of projects. So looking ahead and having explored at a very macro level some of the things going on already, some of the ideas being discussed at multiple levels for a very broad range of topics, I wanted to put forward a few thoughts on what might be some recommendations for advancing engagement, particularly economically, on these issues moving forward. First, as I mentioned earlier, it's really important to have full and faithful implementation of the Chorus FTA, of other existing economic agreements, and also to address issues related to the New Frontiers areas that may arise just because technology moves very quickly, and sometimes regulations and laws and trade rules and other things don't keep up so well. So it's important to find ways to ensure that these don't preclude collaboration and market entry and other things that are important. Within the agreement, Korea has been doing quite well on strengthening its intellectual property protections. That's been a trend even before the FTA was completed. And so that's very positive related to these. There are some issues that continue to come up as relate to cross-border data transfer, data localization, and what that can do to potentially constrain introductions of new models and products across borders. I would say also another part about the importance of successful and faithful implementation is that it shows that despite things that may have happened in the past with difficulty for market entry, that those issues are in the past, that we're past that U.S. businesses can enter Korea, and Korean businesses can enter the U.S. with confidence that we can pursue these products with a level playing field, that we have good intellectual property protections, and this is a good place for business and partnerships. Also note, and this was referred to in the paper again, as new issues arise, and one issue that's arisen as in USTR documents includes some challenges related to Korea-specific cybersecurity requirements. I would broaden that just more looking back, where there are nation-specific rules that even when there are international standards that both countries apply to, maybe there's still something very specific. So just working through those to ensure that, again, these don't preclude good opportunities for market entry and also collaboration. Looking more broadly, both countries are independently pursuing their other trade agreements and other trade frameworks. Korea is part of the RCEP negotiations. The U.S. is going to be pursuing bilateral agreements. And where there are some shared goals, including those that are reflected within the Chorus FTA, finding ways to advance these within these other these shared goals within everyone's individual agreements could also be beneficial, again, just given the globalization of supply chains. And, if or whenever there may be opportunities for these to intersect, including through future multilateral agreements. A third area that could be interesting relates to workforce training and educational development to prepare students and workers in both countries for careers in the new frontier sectors. And these sectors are each those that require a lot of specialized training, not necessarily doctorates, but certainly specific skills, be it engineering, be it STEM, be it specific manufacturing and scientific capabilities. And this is really a challenge that both countries are encountering. I remember a few years ago, President Lee made some waves by saying, maybe not everyone needs to go to college. We need people who are trained to do these other important skills. And this is really something that you're hearing quite a bit now all across the United States. Certainly for manufacturers that I speak with, a constant refrain all around the region is we can't find workers that have the skills we need, particularly in areas such as aerospace and information technology that really are the drivers of the Northwest economy these days. There have been quite a lot of efforts, speaking more on what I've seen in the Northwest, to really increase the resources available, including through community and technical college networks, creation of centers of excellence the developed curriculum to work on addressing these issues in very close partnership with industry. And this might be an interesting place for the two countries to look at, and particularly, I can't speak to cases in the U.S. where, for example, there's quite a bit of Korean investment already, where these companies might also already be involved in these areas. But thinking through, are there merits in doing technical training exchanges with specialists, short-term programs in really cutting-edge areas, developing joint curriculum, and cyber would also, again, just given many events going on, but also the strong base skills both countries have in this, that might be an interesting area for something like this. Fourth, looking at subnational level projects that relate to the New Frontiers areas. There's quite a bit of that going on already, as I mentioned. And there's some interesting models out there that may be useful to consider in the Korea-U.S. and Korea-U.S. states and regions context. To share one may be something basic such as memorandums of cooperation. This is an approach that Japan has been taking in recent years and now has signed agreements with the states of California, Washington, and Maryland. They articulate a range of specific economic areas where they'd like to see collaboration. Maryland's, for example, has a heavy biotech focus. The agreement with Washington covers the aerospace sector for sure, but also climate change and some environmental issues that are very important to the economy there. And some of these activities, while in the early stage, could again not just be traditional activities such as bringing business missions and scholarly missions back and forth, but also thinking through, in some of these cutting-edge areas or highly technical areas, bringing experts over, doing some fact-finding information exchanges on a more sustained basis. They also present opportunities to maybe look at some issues that it may not be as easy to do traction on at the national level. I'll highlight climate change in this regard because, we'll see where the Trump administration takes climate change policy at the national level. But states on the West Coast, for example, California in particular, have strongly articulated that this is an area they want to continue to pursue very actively. It's something that is not limited to the domestic sphere. The West Coast states have spoken with British Columbia to coordinate across the Canadian border. And then 2 years ago, when President Xi visited the United States, there was an interesting agreement that was signed between several U.S. and Chinese state and local governments to share information, engage in these areas. So again, there are some other models out there that may prove interesting and appropriate looking between Korea and the United States. And then finally, encouraging participation of a broad range of private sector, university, non-governmental connections to work in these areas. One of the most important things said about the New Frontiers areas by then Ambassador Lippert is quote, broadening and enhancing our people-to-people ties. This issue set has the potential to involve new constituencies such as doctors, engineers, and research scientists in the relationship in increasing numbers. And over the decades, the extensive interconnections at these and other levels between our two countries have just proliferated rapidly. It's pretty incredible, and opened some doors. To share some local examples of time with the New Frontier areas, on fuel cell, there has been collaboration between many universities. There's a project that's gone on between the University of South Carolina and Woosuk University in Korea. Virginia Tech has done some very basic things with Korea's Microgrid Institute. And there are other similar models for this as well, again, pointing to other countries. One intriguing example that I've seen is the International Institute for Carbon Neutral Energy Research, which is a joint project between Kyushu National University in Japan and the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, that is really a joint research effort with facilities in both countries, and near parity in terms of how many Japanese and how many non-Japanese, primarily Americans, are involved doing some very interesting collaborative activity. Maybe there's already some of this in the works. I'll be excited to see that. And one more example I'll just mention, that again shows some of the things that are going on with other countries is the Global Innovation Exchange, which is a new initiative that the University of Washington in Seattle is pursuing with Tsinghua University in China, with significant support from Microsoft, and they will be finalizing later this year a campus that will be bringing in instructors and students from both countries with the doors open to other partners to really develop innovation and technology thought leaders across a targeted set of sectors, many of which intersect with the New Frontiers areas. So in closing, just to share a few concluding reflections, and I've covered a lot of ground here. The New Frontiers areas really reflect in many ways the continuing evolution of the bilateral relationship, one into a partnership that is positioned to address and develop solutions for complex global challenges as well as national priorities. In this regard, they can serve as catalysts for where our relationship goes moving forward, economically as well as security. And as a comparatively new area, there's a lot of room to work with these, and this could be a very ideal area for both administrations to take ownership, to maybe they could change the name or recategorize this in some ways, but they're a very good subset that the two governments can take ownership of, and advances a positive story within an evolving and very dynamic bilateral relationship. And tied in with that also is just the importance in both countries moving forward to ensure a continued robust domestic science, technology and innovation strategies that really will support and provide foundation for the growth of these sectors, both at home, together, and overseas. With that, thank you very much. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thanks, Sean. It's a great presentation. Normally, when we talk about when the New Frontiers issues are considered, they're considered individually. I think you did an excellent job of combining them and talking about them holistically and some of their connecting characteristics. And I really like at the end how you drew in some other examples and advocated for using the New Frontiers in other venues. And something that immediately comes to my mind is a program we did here a couple of weeks ago on the trilateral relationship between Japan, Korea, and the United States. And there are connections between the United States and Korea and the United States and Japan on many of these same issues. Do you think that there's a possibility to sort of use this model of strengthening cooperation on the New Frontiers of cooperation to build stronger trilateral relations, mainly improving on the Korea-Japan leg?
Thanks, Kyle. That's a great question, and I would surmise that there may already be some such activities going on. I know during my years with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, it was something that we were always very interested in, which is as the three economies continue to converge, where might there be trilateral opportunities to pursue common interests, common challenges, and I believe that there have been some nascent trilateral activities on maybe information technology more specifically that the Chamber with its partners in Korea and Japan have pursued. That's very encouraging. It's great to see. One of the challenges, of course, is the political environment in which these things can happen, and so that can be conducive. It can sometimes be difficult. And to that end, I think, even though these should be relatively non-controversial issues where there's a lot of competition that might factor in as well, this might also be another area where if the timing may be and the conditions may be a little bit challenging to do these things at a national level, looking at where there may be some activities to be done outside of government, between universities, between regions, research institutions. But there's a lot of, I think, fertile ground for that area, and I think it'll probably become more imperative as, again, thinking a bit more from a security perspective, to what degree the challenges are shared. And cyber could be a very good example of that, just to name one. But when it gets into, space can be a little bit tricky again because of national security reasons. But energy technology is another one that comes to mind too, in terms of these have been major priorities in all three countries. Japan, of course, has a very well-established nuclear industry, and Korea's emerged as a competitor to theirs, for example, on the project in the United Arab Emirates a few years back. But at the same time, there's also a shift going on there in terms of how do we meet our energy needs with wanting to reduce our carbon footprint, and also concerns amongst the public about nuclear safety. So certainly the level of dialogue and ideally maybe more, this would be a really fertile area, I think, for trilateral engagement.
Great, thank you. Is there a question in the back corner?
Yeah, Paul Tyson from the State Department. You had made some allusion to things that had happened under the Kim Dae-jung administration. Do you think the new administration in Korea will be looking back towards some of those things and bringing it forward?
That's a wonderful question, and it's a little bit early for me to speak to what this new administration will do. Separate from their energy policies, I've not had the the chance to really digest, what they've said, and of course what people raised during the campaign may turn into something quite different as they work to implement. One concern I have actually looking back is that there seems to have also been a propensity to, as governments change, to maybe turn away from initiatives that the prior administration were doing that had good merits, but maybe for various reasons just had lost some favor or were not an intended focus. And so green growth is a good example of this. For all the very positive aspects of that, by the time that President Park took power, there were some domestic sensitivities around what green growth is or was. And so I remember visiting Seoul 1 month after President Park took office, and people didn't want to talk about green growth. And it's a shame because it's not they didn't want to talk about those issues, but rephrasing them and finding new ways to discuss them, which is only unfortunate when there's the risk that some very good, positive, and progressive initiatives may fall by the wayside. I bring this up in the context of the creative economy set of policies because while there was a lot of attention about creating creative economy centers in various locations across the country, there was also a lot that was endeavored to do to address broader structural challenges. The access to finance and venture capital, of course, was a major early focus, and also cultural shifts. And these things are inherently long-term. You can't there's some things you can do in a short time frame, but we're talking about things that even in the United States take decades and have taken decades to evolve. So one thing that I'll be watching as the Moon administration puts forward more of its policy statements and how they structure things is how do they approach these issues, not just as issue-specific topics, cyber, space, energy, to name a few, but more broadly, how are they going to be building on or shifting gears as it relates to this broader question of shaping the framework for science and innovation policy within Korea? Will they continue to build on where things were working well, perhaps with the creative economy, or is the view that, we need to do something completely different, we need to go back to the drawing board? That's something I'll be watching really carefully. Looking back even to the Kim Dae-jung administration, there is some commonality in some of the baseline goals, and that included, for example, bringing up Korea's research and development percentages. And right now, the most recent OECD data I'd seen was from 2013, and Korea was at 4.1% of GDP. That's very close to the 5% goal that had been expressed in the past. It's been slow in coming, but it has been growing. That's good to see. So that's, answer your question, that's one of the things I'll be watching very carefully. And I think also, given that there was a lot of looking to U.S. examples in particular as those policies came together, for example, crowdfunding and other finance things, what happens here in the U.S. Is going to be watched very carefully. What are the successful models? What helps break the bottlenecks? And so being mindful of what happens here domestically as well, I think, is an important part of that.
Yes, thanks.
Virgil Strohmeyer, also the State Department, with some connection to the Arctic Council. With the developments in the Arctic, especially with the Korean emphasis on shipbuilding before, do you see the Koreans getting at all interested in icebreakers and other issues such as that?
That's a wonderful question. I would fully expect it. I'm certainly not an expert on the shipbuilding industry in Korea, but one thing that I've heard and have been watching is the challenges it's had. Certainly in the Northwest, there were a lot of concerns when Hanjin went bankrupt because they've been a major partner for some of our major ports, and thinking about where to pursue new market entries. We do have some firms in our area that are major shipbuilders, building icebreakers, and how much of a market there is for that. So it's a good question, but certainly something that it would not surprise me and that I'd be watching very carefully.
Yes. Please wait for the microphone.
Thanks. Frederick Rees-Ramon. I'm with a small company called Persidus International. In a past life, I was in government, and focused mostly on international government-to-government science and technology cooperation, cooperative development programs, and so forth. And in the private sector, I've sort of continued that, looking for technologies and finding partners for those and markets for those. So two questions I had, or general areas. One, when you were talking about the technology development in Korea and all these different areas of technology, one question I had was, where in the technology development cycle are the Koreans particularly focused on? Is it early research? Is it more of the application of research? Or is it the development of products that are the result of research that's been concluded and proved, and now it's a matter of putting together a product? And related to that, who funds research, regardless of where along that spectrum it is? Is it mostly government funded, or does the private sector itself actually invest money in research and development? And I don't mean just in product development. That was one thing. And the other one was, where are the Koreans looking in terms of growth for the technologies they do develop? You mentioned a lot of technologies that are of great interest in places like Latin America, Africa, et cetera. You mentioned batteries, smart grid, healthcare, and so forth. Where are they aiming towards in terms of developing markets for the products they do develop from those technologies?
Thank you. All very good questions, and I'll cover these as best I can. Regarding where in the tech cycle Korea tends to be, Korea's been very heavily slanted towards applied research. Basic research has been quite low. And that's something that actually has been a factor within national government policy to really help to get more of the basic research funded that will lead to other new technologies versus product and process improvements. And I think this is somewhat reflected in the performance we see from many of Korea's leading global companies. They're extremely good at process improvements, really good at increasing the quality, really good at bringing the costs down. But maybe we don't see as many just market-shattering, groundbreaking, new tech, innovation leaps or things like that. And so that's well noted there. And I think what we're starting to see also is more government funding going into the basic research. It's slow. A lot of the funding, and this gets into the second part of the question, a lot of funding for R&D and a lot of R&D has really been handled autarkically within the major global conglomerates. They have the resources, they have the scale. They pull those things in, and as a result of that it's sort of it goes back to the difference between the basic research and applied research funding. The companies are investing in the applied research because it meets their needs, and when that's where the money is going, that's where the focus is. So there has been, as part of R&D, increased efforts to put more money into basic research in Korea. It's a major priority, and hopefully that's something that will continue under President Moon. In terms of where the growth markets are, it's a phenomenal question, and I have to say that that's not something I've been tracking as closely, but just for following Korea and its economic relations for about 12, 13 years now, constantly, I'd be surprised where I'd find more Korean products than other things. I had the chance to visit Myanmar about 5 years ago, and the first thing I see getting out of the airport is a giant billboard for Hyundai vehicles. So, that being one case, but where I think certainly at a global level where they can bring the costs down, they have access to markets, particularly in things like batteries, where they have existing strengths, including related to mobile phones, cars, and then related to that. I think what's more in some of the new frontiers areas, it's going to be interesting. I recall about 3 or 4 years ago, there was a huge amount of interest and attention paid to shale gas, the U.S. shale gas development, methane hydrates, which we have some agreements with Korea on. Have not heard as much about that recently. But, one question that was pointed out by people I spoke with at the time is this an area where Korea may be interested in obtaining access to the technology that U.S. firms are developing to do this, then improving it and then exporting it elsewhere? And so I think it's actually something I want to do a bit more research on now that you asked the question. But I think it gets into interesting. And it also, tied in with that is where, in relation to global deployment and global markets, where might there be some really good opportunities for them to do this with U.S. partners, where by virtue of technologies or existing or potential customer relationships, there could be some propensity for joint projects as well. But one thing I'll mention also in relation to that, though it's a bit of an aside, is I was on a business mission to Korea in September of 2015, and one participant in that delegation was the head of the Washington State Technology Industry Association, and they had been involved in an ICT forum with a number of Korean small tech firms in Seoul. I was not there for that, but returned to the Seattle area just really excited and really fired up about the technologies and the things they were seeing there. Were really encouraged to explore more fully. Where can we build more connections? That was really interesting for me because it's not something even there that I'd heard a whole lot about in terms of, where we can do partnerships with Korea. So I think, these all get into some very interesting areas about, not just thinking what we can do bilaterally, but in third markets, where do we have the chance to maybe do some new things and be very successful at it? Thanks.
Yes.
I'm Peter Humphrey. I'm an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. I see a big problem, a big data problem, in that if I want to look carefully and in very fine detail at U.S. Korean scientific research, both in basic and applied fields, there's no central database for me to do that. I can get a bunch of data from NIH. I can get a bunch of data from NSF. I can get a bunch of data from the S&T office and the embassy, who can show me the MOUs. But if I want to find out if there's an American-Korean pair working on the spectroscopy of ancient Korean coins, or an American-Korean pair working on manganese nodules, there is absolutely no central database for me to explore. And certainly the best way to develop research, collaboration, is to build on the things that exist. But if you don't know that they exist, how can you go there? Even if you exploit all the things that I mentioned, there's still hundreds of Koreans who have an American partner that you won't even find by asking NSF or NIH. Is there some body or some congressional mandate we can look to establish that kind of big database, which could really rocket U.S.-Korean collaboration into the future?
Thank you. That's a great idea. It's really interesting to think that, and to put into perspective that there is no one-stop shop. There's no window for these things. And I think, one good question would be, even just domestically within the U.S., do we have one single clearinghouse? When we have an NSF, we have an NIH. Is there one thing I'd be interested to look up, looking back through past bills and other things, is have there been initiatives to try to do this before? And if they haven't happened, why not? What are the barriers? Okay. I think Korea probably has not just been on the radar screen in this area, and so that's a really interesting concept. Thanks for sharing that.
Question back. Next to Troy.
Hi, John. Thank you for the
Great to see you.
presentation. I'm Jun from Japanese Embassy. So surprising or not surprisingly, I found a lot of commonality between U.S.-Korea cooperation and U.S.-Japan cooperation. So given your also background with Japan, handling Japan issues, what do you think the biggest one or two difference between U.S.-Japan and U.S.-Korea in terms of maybe areas or maybe approaches? And then what would you suggest to, further deepen those relationships and even for trilateral relationship?
Thank you. That's a wonderful question. And I think one of the biggest differences between the U.S. and Korea and the U.S. and Japan in this regard is that in so many of these areas, there's a much longer history and track record of U.S.-Japan cooperation and engagement. Space is a great example of this because there's been the number is probably more than this, but I remember hearing a few years ago there's already been 45 MOUs or other agreements between the U.S. and Japan, or NASA and its counterparts, just related to space technologies and engaging going back over nearly 50 years now. And so Korea didn't even have a space program until 1981. So that's a bit more an example of where we have a very highly developed relationship with Japan. Japan's contributed to the International Space Station, and so I think that's one good example of success. And that's, just to point out one parallel to something I mentioned here. New space is now coming up as something of interest, in those areas as well. For example, the Mansfield Foundation has had a U.S.-Japan space policy dialogue for a few years. And last year they brought the participants over to Seattle just to meet with, amongst other things, but really to meet with several interesting companies that are based there. They're doing some very exciting stuff relating to the new space sector with some very interesting business ideas and technologies. Similarly, energy is another area where, again, probably there's a much longer track record, more integration and collaboration. I mentioned the example of Eisner at Kyushu, which is an initiative that goes back to about, I think it was physically founded probably about 2010, 2011, but there's a very interesting story about that, which was that it really emerged organically through the interaction of professors at the universities, around a time when the governor of Fukuoka Prefecture was really trying to make that area a center within Japan for hydrogen research. And so there was some great local initiative and leadership that was being taken where all these things converged in a very positive way. Cyber is an area I will admit in the case of Japan I've not followed as closely, so I can't really speak to that. So I think one of the biggest differences again is we have a long history of this in the U.S. Partnering with Japan. There's more we can do with Korea, particularly as Korea capabilities expand, and also as we have more. I would say the trade and investment relationship as well. Again, given that there's a very long track record within the U.S. of Japanese investment here and what that's done to transform economies and build new partnerships. Korea is certainly moving forward in that regard as well, and with time, we could see some exciting new things. In terms of, maybe what we could do to build upon these, as I mentioned, there's been discussion over the years about maybe more trilateral dialogues. It's an interesting thing, but I think what's also important is to see, what evolves between, counterparts within Korea and Japan alone. What may make sense there may not necessarily make sense involving the U.S. or not, but to think about where there are enough common interests that we can pull those activities in. One thing that I'd be intrigued to learn much more about is where there have been successful partnerships, including but not exclusive to these areas between counterparts in Japan and Korea. Where there are some success stories, that'd be good to look at and also to consider what are the factors that made these successful? How can we build on this? Do other models, be it at a national level or even if it's more institutional or private sector based? But I think it's an extremely fertile area.
Oceanography is huge.
Yeah, that's a great one. And that does factor into the new frontiers categories. Yeah.
Hey, Sean, Scott Thompson with Samsung. How you doing?
Great to see you.
Good to see you too. Curious about the question of who exactly is going to do the cooperating. It kind of comes down to, in both countries' cases, governments establishing a bilateral or multilateral framework to lay the ground rules and provide funding for basic research, as you say, in many cases. But then in some cases, whether you're Microsoft doing R&D in Seoul or Samsung making chips in Texas or buying the Harman U.S. connected car company, those are kind of just things big companies do at this stage of the game worldwide. So are we really talking more about small and medium-sized enterprises in both countries and what governments can do to help them make those connections in R&D and applied research and production? And does the political environment kind of trend toward that direction? President Moon hypothetically could establish more non-tariff barriers to foster small and medium enterprises in Korea to play to his political base. That potentially could hurt Microsoft and Samsung in Korea. Some of those issues come to the fore in this country as well. President Trump could take a harder line on CFIUS for companies making acquisitions and expanding jobs in this country. So are we maybe at a point where the macro trend of U.S.-Korean economic and technological cooperation is in the right direction, but at the micro level in this moment in time, we have some significant challenges still at the same time? And what do you suggest doing about that, if so?
Thanks very much. These are some great points. As you mentioned, a lot of things, especially when you're talking about the larger companies in both countries, things have a momentum of their own, very private sector driven, just because, amongst other things, it makes business sense. U.S. businesses want to be in Korea because they have access to great technology. Alcatel-Lucent was a very good example of that. Korean businesses want to be in the U.S. because they have access, again, to great research technology and also workforce in many areas. When it comes to smaller, medium-sized enterprises, it's a really important element, not just economically, but also politically. And on the one hand, you have some companies, small but hidden champions that have particular niches, capabilities, and may be able to do some of these things on their own. But for others, I think that may be where there's opportunities that, if there's a real goal, particularly by both administrations, that we do want to really continue more efforts in these areas. That's where helping facilitate that in some way may make sense. I don't know that necessarily. I would think, just from my experience working on issues in the bilateral trade relationship, from a policy perspective, what would be ideal is just ensuring that barriers that preclude the trade and investment and collaboration that the private sector really wants to do and is moving towards, that's addressed. But in terms of how to facilitate more opportunities or maybe new initiatives, programs, other things, SMEs would seem to be a natural focus area for that. Looking into the creative economy policies, and I had paid a bit more attention sort of at the earlier onset. I would really love to go back and dig a bit more to see how do these perform in practice. But there was a significant amount of outreach and road shows that were being done by MSIP across the United States. It'd be interesting to see, did any traction come out of that? Were there new partnerships, and particularly at the small and medium-sized enterprise level? Vice versa for smaller U.S. companies who maybe is a great example where this is working. What are the factors, and what does that imply in terms of, might there be a policy solution? Might no policy be the better thing? And then ultimately, if there's a national government involvement, what's the best and most appropriate and most effective use of funding? Is that really that, or really what are those mechanisms? So I think it's a really good point. Looking at some of the individual sectors, some by nature of what they are, there's especially those with the security angle, there's always going to be a government angle, and I put cyber and space very specifically in those categories. Energy is going to be a bit more interesting, and one thing that I think would be intriguing to map out is what's going on between national laboratories, between universities that have very good research and technological capability, who's doing some things on their own, and where do we develop something that's not just top down, but has a number of bottom up aspects and feedback loops where sometimes maybe one little thing going on that has some really interesting implications that maybe could be, expanded upon at a broader, national level. But that's, I think, a really important point to make and a really important consideration, which is how to bring in as many stakeholders as possible, it's great to see this happening at the large multinational company level. That's phenomenal. Now, how can we build on that and get more individual businesses that may not be large and may not have, extremely large chain, but may have some phenomenal technology, phenomenal services that can really contribute to some broader things.
Troy?
Sean, good to see you again. Thanks for
Likewise,
being here.
good to see you.
I have, and some of this will kind of maybe build off Scott's question as well and a few other questions. But so I guess two things I'd be interested in. When we talk about this, and I mean, you're right. I mean, the new frontiers is what we call it now, but if this goes back farther, Imabake Global Korea, there was a joint vision statement where we had not all these issues, but many of these, and so there's overlap. And, so going forward, this isn't simply like an Obama, Pak and Hey thing. This is a U.S. Korea thing. It's a question of continuing. But we tend to think of this bilaterally, and you've hinted some at the trilateral side. So I guess there's sort of two questions I have. One would be, and I think you've probably to an extent done this at least informally with Japan, but have you looked at U.S. collaboration in these or other areas with other countries to see sort of like what works well? Like, is there something we do with the UK that just works really well that we should be applying here, in terms of a framework? And then two, since we are sort of siloing this, or we're saying, well, okay, maybe we should do trilateral cooperation, U.S., Japan, Korea. Is that the right model, or should we, because, and while admittedly the Trump administration may not be enthusiastic on climate change, an issue like that, should you have more of a, call it like, since you mentioned the International Space Station, where you had a consortium of nations come together. So look at certain issues and say, all right, who are the best partners we should have for this issue? Because, the United States, Korea, Japan, the European Union, Canada, Mexico, whomever have the same concern. And how do we put the best people in each of these countries on the projects?
Thanks, Troy. Those are some great questions. And in response to your first question, that's That's something, admittedly, I would benefit from a bit more research on, particularly in terms of what we have done with partners in the European Union. Thinking more broadly in terms of science and technology research, one thing that I'd be intrigued to explore in that regard, if it may offer some models, is interactions that our research institutions and universities have, for example, with the Fraunhofer system in Germany. Fraunhofer does have about 5 or 6 centers located across the U.S. at various universities, maybe at a Battelle lab or 2, I'm not sure. I'd have to double check on that. But these are partnerships where my sense from the couple I've spoken with is that they emerged through partnerships between researchers of both institutions. It made sense and funding was available to bring these together. Fraunhofer is just one example from one country. I'm sure there are others. And so that would be, thinking about science and technology research, particularly as it gets into applied research aspects. That would be one model I think would be really interesting to look at, especially because groups like Fraunhofer are really considered the gold standard. And I know that, for example, what's now called Manufacturing USA, but the NNMI network that the Obama administration launched was an attempt to do something very similar. I think looking at just even successful models overseas as well is really important. I had the chance 3 years ago to visit the United Kingdom's National Composite Center in Bristol, which I was at the time involved with a group that was looking to make a grant proposal to do something very similar in the Pacific Northwest. Didn't inevitably work out, but it was really interesting to see how this center was structured, to see some other similar centers that bring together industry, university, and some public sector in France, where how they worked out the intellectual property agreements to make these the kind of places where businesses are willing to do work and not be afraid that they're going to lose control over their IP. But I think that would be really beneficial and instructive for informing what we do bilaterally. Thinking back to creative economy, Israel kept coming up again and again by the Park administration in terms of, Israel's done well, Yosmo is good, let's do things like this here in Korea to boost our sector. So it's really important, as you note, to look at these other examples and see, where might there be some things that for various reasons we haven't explored that could be some really good segues. I think also looking at international consortiums makes absolute sense. And some of this is in many ways embedded within even the baseline New Frontiers areas as articulated at the time of the summit. These include the engagement within the global health security initiatives that was mentioned. Paris COP21 on climate change. Maybe climate change is not going to be the best area to see some of these activities for a while, but in other sectors, I would wonder, for example, okay, after what everyone's just been through around the world on cybersecurity and can look forward to, what's going to be the solution? How do we pursue this in the strongest way possible? And that would seem to be a very good example for where there's not already activity, not just looking bilaterally, even trilaterally, but really where we bring the resources together. And, particularly looking at the risk management aspect of all these topics too. Again, I think that's a great aspect for these because as mentioned, these aren't exclusively domestic issues. And one of the key things about them is that they really, affect both countries at a global level, but also global level issues. And that Korea is now at that point, on its own and within the bilateral relationship that we're looking actively towards partnerships. It's a very important evolution. It's, not something I'd heard as much about when I started working on Korea issues many years ago. And so it's been a really exciting and encouraging development to watch. But I'd agree that really there's a lot of these things that just make inherent sense at an international level.
We have time for one last question.
Yuki Mamura. Son, welcome back.
Great to see you.
Yeah. I'm curious about different perspective of U.S. and Korean relationship. There is such a big Korean population in this country, and there are so many successful Korean entrepreneurs in this country. So I just wonder whether there is any established either policies or programs to encourage interface between Korean entrepreneurs in this country and Korea. What are the people's perspective of Koreans entrepreneurs in this country by Korean people in Korea, or vice versa? Thank you.
Thanks very much. A great question, and I'll have to caveat my remarks that I was what I'm able to report on this is some things go back a couple of years, so I'm not sure of the current status of this. But in and around the time that President Park was taking office, there was also a lot of focus on maybe what can be done to build more bridges on entrepreneurship between the two countries. And I remember reading about how some very initial meetings were taking place in Seoul to bring together Korean startups with prospective funders, built along models that you would see in Silicon Valley and that you're also seeing in other countries increasingly. And I remember some coverage at the time was pointing out that it was a smaller group, but there was a lot of enthusiasm just in terms of how quickly many of these firms were evolving their pitch, evolving their business model in very competitive ways. And I think an interesting characteristic looking at thinking back to some of the coverage of these firms that were highlighted, many were firms that included people from Korea that had lived or grown up or had gone to university in the United States, Canada, and other countries, and were able to build on these global networks they had as a result of these experiences to access ideas, to access capital, and very nascent. But that's one thing that I think is there. I don't know that there's one clearinghouse or one established mechanism, but there have been a number of these things that have emerged over the years. And it would be interesting to track where those are going in terms of not just the business success, but also what are the technology fields we're seeing these things. And I think a lot that I recall hearing about fell into very innovative mobile apps that had very unique capabilities. But beyond those, are there others in very different fields of science? But as I mentioned earlier, it struck me when the head of our state's technology industry association was over there for an ICT dialogue and just came back in one of the largest centers of ICT innovation in the country, really enthused about what he saw, really enthused about building those partnerships. And I think that would augur well. To your question about what are perceptions in Korea, I mean, it's really interesting, because I remember seeing polls that show that actually there was a lot of public respect for people who did entrepreneurship, but it's incredibly difficult to do there, for many of the same reasons as in many other places. The fear of failure, the stigma that comes with failure. If you try a business, doesn't work out, and you go bankrupt, and how to overcome those perceptions that, it's a dangerous, it's maybe not the right word, but it's a risky path to follow, because if you don't succeed, it's going to be very hard for you to succeed in other things. So changing that mindset has been a really important factor and was actually a big part of even what the government was trying to do with creative economy. So that question, I think it's an interesting one to look into. It gives me some homework as well to kind of see where things are going with that. But an interesting characteristic is that many of these startups that were getting some attention have in many ways a very inherent bilateral, trilateral nature, just because of the backgrounds of the people participating in them, crossing U.S.-Korea boundaries, U.S.-Canada, U.S.-Australia, other countries.
Thank you all for your excellent questions, and please join me in thanking Sean for his time today.